facilitated by Wendy Sullivan. I wanted to find time in my day to get some exercise, and I talked about putting time aside for that, and life moving by, and not being able to find the time to do that. And Wendy's now going to talk about a few of the things that she noticed as a clean language facilitator that she was using to pick up on how to help me understand my situation better. And at the end of the session, I did have a different way of looking at it, which was useful. From only a 3 or 4 minute session, we did a very quick demo.
So the first thing that struck me was the fact that you were putting time aside for exercise, but the exercise wasn't happening. And I started to muse about what happens when you put time aside, because mostly when you put things aside, you do it in order to not pay any attention to them, to not have them in your awareness. And that seemed to be what was happening with exercise. And so we got a location for where it is that you put things aside. And then we checked where it was that life, where everything keeps moving, happens. And the two were, of course, different. So the putting time aside happened to your right, and life moving and happening was ahead of you. So straight away one starts to consider that it's possibly not surprising that exercise isn't happening. But then what became apparent was that from where you are, you don't see the bit where the time has been put aside. You just see life moving on. And so I started to think about a model we use on the advanced modules of clean language training that considers where the perceiver is. And I think the same thing happened for you, similar sort of time, because you started to consider that if you looked at it from a different perspective, it would make a difference. And so you weren't changing the perceiver, it was still you who was doing the perceiving of life moving on and of doing exercise. But that if you moved yourself to further back, behind where you are, that then you could take in both the time for the exercise and life moving on all in one go. So that seemed like it had some potential. Just by moving the perceiver, you change the context, include more of the context of your life, and include the exercisey bit. So that was interesting. There was some musing about the fact that there was no adjacency, no physical nearbyness between exercise and life. And that also was part of what I was musing about. Musing being another thing that's part of the advanced modules. There's thinking about the implications of what the client's saying. And that was another possible option you came up with, that you could either move where you've been putting the time for exercise to somewhere closer to where life happens, or you could move yourself so that you could see them both. So again, musing about that. And inevitably...
Wendy, just to make it, part of what I like about clean language is you weren't pushing on me which solution I'd come up with, that as part of this sort of session, I would say what's going on for me, and I would have the space if I wanted to try out different options, and then when I choose one, I'd most likely like it and stick with it better.
Certainly, I was absolutely not going for saying how this issue should be resolved. There are far too many people walking around wanting to do more exercise and not doing it, so no point at all in pretending that I knew how it would happen. But interesting that in a matter of only about 4-ish minutes, with a little bit of thinking about the implications of how things are, and asking a few questions, that you could come up with some possible solutions. And it has to be said, there were plenty of more angles to take had those solutions not occurred to you. Like you mentioned several times about life moving on. So that starts one thinking about scale of, so how fast is life moving? And in what direction is it moving? Because that might give some information about how it comes about that exercise doesn't fit in. If it's going like a speeding bullet, that might be useful information for a client to have versus, life that's just inching away, going at a snail-like speed. So again, scaling is often one of those things that gets in the middle of what's going on for people. One of those universal things that people use for doing relativeness in their lives. And so that was one that I had in my little mental list of possible things to consider. And inevitably I was thinking about patterns. Is any of what you were saying pattern-like? Does it operate at a more overall all-embracing level in your life that might be useful for you to know about? There's no way that I could claim that that we had any certainty about that in the 4-minute thing. But I was certainly starting to consider whether we were seeing beginnings of any patterns, and wondering about moving having something to do with possible patterns, in that it had come up a number of times. We had a little bit in the way of explanations as well as to how it came about that exercise didn't get included in your life, which I was aware of because of a model that we use on the advanced modules that looks at the explanations people give and the reasons that they give, the causes that they reckon exist to cause behaviors. And it seemed as though that moving of life was one of the causes of exercise not happening. So I'm not making any judgments one way or another, just noticing that that's part of how the world seems to you, and noting that that might be something to explore, so that if you weren't consciously aware of it, you could consider it and decide whether that is in fact how you reckon life is, or whether it wanted updating or in any way changing.
Wendy, as you're talking there, I'm now more conscious of how I organize my thoughts and how I prioritize things. And at the moment that I prioritize something, if I do it in my current way, certain things won't get done. And if I am more conscious about how I choose to prioritize things, then there's a good chance that something different will happen, and something I want to have happen will happen.
Indeed. I think this is exactly it with the sort of angle of thinking about patterns, that maybe realizing that putting time aside for exercise and doing that by metaphorically putting it to one side of you while life happens in front of you, realizing that's not working well for you in and of itself can be useful. But if one can start to do that, actually I often do putting time aside for something or other, and small wonder I don't always get to do these things that I imagine that I'm kind of prioritizing, then that's got potential to make a much more useful impact on one's life. So yeah, it's a nice example of a kind of a pattern that someone could be running. And pretty good to have, those potentially a whole lot of insights along those lines in a matter of 4 or 5 minutes.
No, I got something out of it, and I like that the more I do clean language, the more I notice things myself. So it helps. I like it to point to things, but then as I do more sessions, I notice things myself. So then there's another layer, a second layer, or I can notice further things because I can look. I'm starting from a better place as well.
Yeah, and I'm sure that happened with you working out that you could either keep your locations for exercise and life and move back relative to them, view them from further back, or that you could move the location of one or other, and that either of those would be ways in which the relationship between them would change.
Yeah.
It didn't need me to say anything or particularly direct your attention, because you've got those awarenesses from the training you've already done.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Great.
Good stuff.
Okay. Well, thank you for the quick session and the discussion. It's got me thinking about a few things now in itself. I've done your modules. I've very much enjoyed them. Recommend them to anyone else.